Good morning. Page 281. In our chamber of monstrosities, the leading intellectuals were considered to be Belyayev and Zinoviev, and as for the foreman, Orashevsky, and the stock clerk and toolmaker, the coarse and uncultured fellow Prokhorov. Their presence offended the feelings of these highly placed people, and during the period when I was Prime Minister, the General and the MVD man both managed to appeal to me, trying to persuade me to toss both these peasants out of our room, but of their slovenliness, their way of lying down, and their cuts in their boots, and in general their lack for intellectual qualities. The generals were giving thought to getting rid of the peasant who fed them, but in fact I liked them both. I myself am a peasant at heart, and so I balance was established in the room, and very soon, no doubt of the generals spoke to someone about me, trying to have me thrown out as well. Orashevsky really did have a coarse exterior. And there was nothing intellectual about him. In music, he understood nothing but Ukrainian songs. He had never heard anything at all of an ancient Italian painting, nor of modern French painting. Whether he loved books I couldn't say, because we had none in camp. He never intervened in the abstract arguments which used to start up in the room. He seemed to not even hear Belyayev's best monologues on the subject of the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan and Zinoviev on his apartment. During his free time, he preferred to brood for long periods in gloomy silence, with his feet placed on the rail at the foot of the cot, the heels of his boots on the rail itself, their soles aimed at the generals, not out of a desire to taunt, but because in getting ready for line-up, or in the lunch interval, or in the evening, if one expects to go out again, how could any reasonable person renounce the satisfaction of lying down for a moment? And it was a lot of fuss to take boots off. They had been pulled tightly over 2 sets of footcloths. Orashevsky also failed to react to the doctor's self-torments and doubts, and then suddenly, after having been silent for an hour or two, he might, quite regardless of what was going on in the room at that time, declare tragically, "Yes, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a 58 to get out of jail." On the other hand, in practical arguments on the attributes of everyday objects, or on the conduct in everyday life, he might mobilize all his Ukrainian stubbornness to assert and prove with great passion that felt boots, Valenki, spoil from being dried out on the stove, and that it was better and pleasanter to wear them the whole winter without drying them out. So, of course, what kind of an intellectual could he be? But he alone, of all of us, was sincerely devoted to the construction project. He alone could speak with interest about it in non-working time. Learning that the Czechs had to manage to break down the partitions between the rooms that were already completely installed and use them for firewood, he seized his rough head and his rude hands and rocked back and forth as if in pain. He could not comprehend the natives' barbarity, perhaps because he had been in prison for only a year. Someone came and said that they had dropped a concrete block from the 8th floor. Everyone exclaimed, "Did it kill anyone?" But Orashevsky said, "Did you see how it broke? What directions the cracks ran in?" The slabs had been cast according to his drawings, and he wanted to know. And what he wanted to know was whether he had put reinforcing rods in the right places. In the severe December cold, the Brigadiers and the foremen had gathered in the office one day to warm themselves and recount assorted camp gossip. Orshevsky came in, took off a mitten and triumphantly, and with great care, emptied from it onto the desk an unmoving but still living orange and black beauty of a butterfly. Now that's a butterfly for you. To survive the frost like that, at 5 below. She was sitting on one of the rafters. Everyone gathered around the butterfly and all fell silent. Those of us who proved fortunate enough to survive would be unlikely to end our terms with any more liveliness in them than that butterfly. Orshevsky had been given only 5 years, had been imprisoned for facial crime, really out of Orwell, for a smile. He had been an instructor in an engineer's school while showing another teacher in the classroom something in Pravda. He had smiled. The other teacher was killed soon after, so no one ever found out what Orshevsky had been smiling at. But the smile had been observed, and the fact that of smiling at the central organ of the party was itself sacrilege. Then Orshevsky was invited to make a political report. He replied that he would carry out the order, but he would be making a report without enthusiasm. This had filled the cup to overflowing. Now which of the two, Pravdin or Orshevsky, was the closer to being an intellectual? And there is no getting round speaking of Prokhorov here. He was a portly peasant, heavy-footed, with a heavy stare, and not much friendliness in his face, for he only smiled after thinking something through. In the archipelago, men like that are called grey wolf. He had no inclination to make any concessions of his own or to do good to anyone. But what I like about him right off was this: in bringing Zinoviev his mess tins and Belyayev his bread, Prokhorov was not servile, with a false smile or even an empty word. Somehow he delivered these things majestically and with reserve, showing thereby that service was service, but not that he was no mere boy. Showing thereby that service was service, but that he was no mere boy. To feed his big workers' body, he had to have a lot to eat. For the sake of the general's gruel and grits, he was willing to suffer his humiliating position. His humiliating position in silence. Knowing that they despised him there, he did not answer them rudely, but neither did he go running off in a flurry of haste for them on tiptoe. He could see through all of us, every last one of us he could see through, as if we were naked, but the occasion never did arise for him to speak his mind. He felt about Prokhorov that he was founded on bedrock, that much of our people rests on shoulders like his. He was in no hurry to smile at anyone. His gaze was sullen, but he never snapped at anyone's heels either. He had not been imprisoned under Article 58, but he had understood that the facts of life from beginning to end. For many years, he had been the chairman of the village Soviet near Fominsk. In that kind of job, one has to also know how to twist and turn, and to be cruel, and to stand one's own ground against the higher-ups. Here is how he described his work as chairman. To be a patriot means always to be out on the lead, in the lead, and it is obvious that you're going to be the first to run into all kinds of trouble. You make the report to the village Soviet, and even though village talk for the most part comes down to material things, nonetheless some long beards let fly. What's permanent revolution? The devil take it, whatever it is. I know that city women wear permanents, and if you don't answer him, they'll say, you've stuck your pig's snout where it doesn't belong. And so I say that it is a kind of revolution that twists and turns and can't be held in the hand. go to the city and look at the women's curls or on a sheep. And when our people started cursing out MacDonald, I corrected the authorities in my report. And you, comrades, I said, would do better to step less on other dogs' tails. Excuse me. Over the years, he had become familiar with all the window dressing of our life and had himself participated. He summoned the collective farm chairman and one day said, "Get one milk made ready for a gold medal at the agricultural fair with a daily milking record of 60 liters. And in the whole collective they collaborated to turn out such a milkmaid. They filled her cow's manger with high-protein feeds and even sugar, and the whole village and the whole collective farm knew what that agricultural fair was worth. But above all, they were placating, kidding themselves, which means this was what they wanted. When the front approached Narrow-Fominsk, Prokhorov, entrusted with evacuating the village Soviet's cattle, but this measure, when you get down to it, was not aimed at the Germans, but against the peasants themselves. They were the ones left behind on the bare earth without cattle or tractors. The peasants didn't want to hand their cattle over and fought back. They were hoping the collective farms would fall apart and the cattle would then come to them, and they nearly killed Prokhorov. The front rolled past their village and settled down for the whole winter. An artilleryman from way back in 1914, Prokhorov, without cattle and as a last resort, joined up with a Soviet artillery battery and carried shells until they drove them away. In the spring of 1942, Soviet power returned to their district, and Prokhorov again became the chairman of the village Soviet. But now he had acquired the full power to settle accounts with his enemies and to become a worse cur than before. And he would have prospered to this day, but strangely he did not. His heart had been shaken. Their locality was desolated, and they gave the chairman bread coupons to provide a bit from the bakery for those whose homes had burned down and for those who were close to starvation. Prokhorov, however, began to take pity on the people and disobeyed orders by overspending coupons and got imprisoned under the law of 7/8 for 10 years. They had forgiven him, MacDonald, because of his lack of learning, but they did not forgive him human mercy. Prokhorov, too, liked to lie there in the room for hours at a time, just like Oreshevsky, with his boots on the footrail and his cot, looking at the peeling ceiling. He only spoke up when the generals weren't present. I was fascinated by some of his judgments and expressions. What kind of line is harder to draw, one straight or one crooked? For a straight line, you like to have instruments, while even a drunk can draw a crooked line with his foot. So it is with the line of life. Money nowadays has two stories. How apt that was. Prokhorov was referring to the way foodstuffs were bought from the collective farm at one price and sold to people at quite a different price. But he saw this on a broader plane too. The two stories of money are apparent in many areas. It permeates our whole life. The state pays us money on the first floor, and we have to pay out money everywhere on the second floor. And what that means is that we ourselves also have to collect somewhere on the second floor, since otherwise you'd go quickly bust. A human being is not a devil. He won't let you live, was another of his proverbs. And there was much else in the same spirit, and I very much regret that I failed to preserve it all. I called this room a chamber of monstrosities, but I could not have classified either Prokhorov or Oreshevsky as a monstrosity. However, out of 6, there was a majority of monstrosities, because what I was myself is not a monstrosity. Scraps and snatches of tangled-up beliefs, false hopes, and imaginary convictions still floated around my head, even though they were already tattered and torn. And although I was already entering on the second year of my term, I still did not understand the finger of fate, nor what it was pointing out to me, thrust out there onto the archipelago. I was still under the influence of the first superficial and corrupting thought instilled in me by that special assignment prisoner at Presnia. Just don't get into general work, survive. Inward development and the direction of general work came to me with great difficulty. One night a passenger car came to the gatehouse, and a jailer entered our room, shook General Belyayev by the shoulder, and ordered him to accompany him with his things. They led out the general, who was still dazed from having been suddenly awakened. He managed to send us a note from the Butirki. Don't lose heart. Evidently, he meant because of his departure. If I am alive, I will write. He did not write what we found out about him elsewhere. They evidently considered him dangerous in a Moscow camp. He was sent to Potma. There were no thermos jugs with homemade soup there, and I rather imagine he no longer cut off the side of his bread ration on 6 sides. And half a year later, we heard rumors that he had sunk very low at Potma, and he was distributing gruel so as to get a sip now and then. I do not know whether it's true. As I stay in camp, I'll sell it to you for what I paid for it. And so, losing no time, the very next morning, I got myself the job of assistant norm setter in the general's place, still without having learned to painting. But I didn't learn norm setting either, but only multiplied and divided to my heart's content. In the course of my new work, I had occasion to go roaming about the whole construction site, and time to sit on the ceiling of the 8th floor of our building. In other words, as if on the roof. And from there, we prisoners had a panoramic view of Moscow. On one side were the Sparrow Hills, still open and clear. The future Lenin prospect had just been projected and outlined, but did not exist. The insane asylum, Kanechkova Dasha, could be seen in its pristine original state. In the opposite direction were the cupola of the Novodevichy Monastery, the carcass of the Frunze Academy, and in a violet haze, far, far ahead, beyond the bustling streets, was the Kremlin, where all they had to do was merely sign the amnesty, which had already been prepared for us. We, the doomed, were tempted by the sight of this world, which in its riches and glory was virtually at our feet, yet at the same time forever unattainable. No matter how much a greenhorn I was, and champing at the bit, out in freedom, the city did not arouse in me envy or the wish to soar down onto its streets. All the evil holding us prisoner had been woven there. This arrogant city had never before provided such a justification as it did now, after the war, for saying Moscow turns its back on its tears. Moscow turns its back on tears. Although we were trustees, we were work trustees, and our room wasn't the main room. Up above us there was another one, just like it, where the compound trustees lived, and whence the triumvirate of the bookkeeper Solomon, the stock clerk Berchader, and the work assigner Bernstein ruled our camp. Right there was Right there, the reorganization was decided on. Pavlov to be removed from his position as works manager and replaced by K. And so one day, this new prime minister came into our living room, and just before that, Pravdin, despite all his attempts to curry favor, had been hauled off on a prisoner transport. They didn't suffer me around much longer. They kicked me out of the norm-setting work and out of that room as well. In camp, when you fall in social position, you rise up to the upper level on a multiple bunk. But while I was still there, I had time to observe Kay, who filled out our small model not all that badly, with one additional important post-revolutionary variety of the intellectual. Alexander Fyodorovich K., a 35-year-old calculating and grasping businessman, in other words, a brilliant organizer, was a construction engineer by profession, but somehow he showed very little professional skill and merely fussed about with a slide rule. He had received 10 years under the terms of the law of August 7 and had served 3 already. Had thoroughly oriented himself in camp and felt himself as free and easy as here as out in freedom. It was as if general work did not threaten him in the least. All the less, therefore, he was inclined to take pity on the untalented masses doomed precisely to this general work. He was one of those prisoners whose actions put more fear into the Czechs than the actions of the archipelago's inveterate bosses. Once he had grabbed you by the throat, he would never let go or relax his grip. He got a reduction of rations by increasing the differentials, deprivation of visits from relatives, and dispatch of more prisoners out on transports. Anything to squeeze more out of the prisoners. Both the camp and the construction were equally delighted with him. But here was what was interesting. All those devices were clearly and obviously methods predating camp. That is how he had learned to lead out in freedom, and it turned out that this method of leadership was exactly what he wanted in camp. Similarities aid cognition. I soon noticed that Kay reminded me very much of someone else. Of whom? Of Leonid Z, my Lubyanka cellmate. Not at all primarily an external appearance, not at all for Z. Had it been a boar-like, and Kay was tall, slim, and gentlemanly, but juxtaposed, they enabled me to perceive through them a whole generation. That first wave of the new engineers who had been awaited impatiently, so that the old specialists could be thrown out of their jobs and be, many of them, repressed. And they had arrived, first as graduates of the new Soviet higher technical education institutions. As engineers, they could not hold a candle to the engineers of the older generation, even in the breadth of their technical education or their artistic sensitivity and love for their work, even in comparison with the Bear Oreshevsky, evicted from the room right off. The resplendent K immediately turned out to be an empty chatterbox. As claimants to a general culture, they were comic. K said, "My favorite work is 3 Colors of Time by Stendhal," though dealing hesitantly with the integral x squared dx. He plunged right into arguments with me on any question of higher mathematics. He had memorized 5 to 10 school phrases in German, and he used them whether they were appropriate or not. He did not know English at all, but stubbornly argued about correct English pronunciation, which he had once heard in a restaurant. He had a notebook with aphorisms he often used to browse through and to learn phrases by heart so as to be able to shine on the right occasion. But despite all this, one would have expected from them, who had never seen the capitalist past, who had been in no possible way infected by its ulcers, a Republican purity, our own Soviet infidelity to principles. Many of them had received high positions and very high salaries straight from the school desk, and during the war, the motherland had excused them from the front, and had demanded nothing in return beyond the use of their professional skills. And because of this, they were patriots. They joined the party with no enthusiasm. What they had never experienced was a fear of class-based accusations, and therefore they were not afraid of overstepping in their decisions. And on occasion, they defended these decisions by shouting. For the same reason, they were not shy in the face of the working masses, and on the contrary, they kept a common, cool, resolute grip on them. And that was all, in accordance with their possibilities. They tried to keep their working day limited to 8 hours, and afterward, the cup of life began. Actress, the Hotel Metropole, and the Hotel Savoy. And from here, the stories of K and Z were astonishingly alike. Here, in K's account of an ordinary Sunday in the summer of 1943, not without exaggeration, but in the main correct. And you believed him right off, too. Telling us about it, he grew quite radiant. Saturday evening, we used to roll off the Prague restaurant dinner. Do you understand what dinner is for a woman? For a woman, it's absolutely unimportant what she had for breakfast or luncheon, or what kind of work she does during the day. What's important to her is her dress, her shoes, and her dinner. At the Prague, there was a blackout, but you could go up to the roof anyway. There was a balustrade. The aromatic summer air. The Arbat down below, sleepy and blacked out. The Arbat is the arts district in Moscow, I believe. Next to you, a woman in a silk. He would always stress that word, dress. We have caroused the whole night long, and now we were drinking only champagne. From behind the spires of the Defense Ministry, a crimson sun floats up. Sunlight, window panes, roofs. We pay the bill. My personal car waits at the exit. It had been summoned by phone. The wind pours through the open car windows and refreshes us at the Dachau, the pine woods. Do you understand what the pine forest is like in the morning? Several hours of sleep behind closed shutters. We wake about 10 when the sun is trying to break through the Venetian blinds. All around the room is lovely disorder of women's clothes. A light breakfast. Do you understand what light means? Red wine on the veranda. And then friends drop in. The river, sunning, bathing. And in the evening, off by car to our respective homes. If it is a workday Sunday, then after breakfast, round about 11, you have to go off to give a few orders. Now, can the two of us ever understand each other? He sits there on my cot and tells his story, waving his hands for greater accuracy in the entrancing details, twisting his head in the burning voluptuousness of recollection. And I remember one after another of those fearsome Sundays of the summer of 1943. July 4th, at dawn, the whole earth shook to the left of us on the Kursk arc, and the crimson sun provided the light for us to read the following leaflets. Surrender. You have more than once experienced the crushing strength of the German attacks. July 11th, at dawn, thousands of whistles cut through the air above us. Our own attack on oil has begun. A light breakfast? Of course I understand. It is still dark in the trenches, and 1 pan of American pork stew for 8 men. And then, hurrah, for the motherland, for Stalin, and over the top. That's a beautiful end to the chapter. Thanks for listening. Hope you have a good day.